In part two of our look at methods and rules for the study of cities, we're going to talk about the city as a case study. And many of you are probably familiar with case studies, have used case studies in other classes. We've seen within our chapters there's some embedded case studies that really look to provide the case study as it is defined as a clear and well-defined example to cover a topic. Again, we look at a lot of case studies in academia, and within studying cities, what we're looking to do is use our case studies to really provide the evidence to support an argument. Um, when we look at a phenomena, we want to make sure that it is valid and that it is reliable. A good example that we could use as a case study is segregation. And in a number of cities, we could see how de jure and de facto segregation go hand in hand. In the 1930s, the United States started to produce what are called red line maps. And red line maps were used in almost 240 cities to determine which cities were low risk for receiving investment. And the criteria for risk was based on two things. Number one, the age and condition of the properties in the neighborhood, which is something that is still used today. A neighborhood that is older and in poor physical condition is one that is less likely to receive funding. Um, the second criteria used to define risk was the race and ethnicity of the borrowers. And through redlining, we created what's known as de jure segregation or legal segregation, where individuals who were ethnic or racial minorities were unable to acquire loans through normal legal channels, and as a result, we had white individuals, white homeowners, white property buyers were able to acquire loans in the nicer neighborhoods where the properties were newer, the physical condition was better. So this resulted in segregation, separation of populations, where we had a lot of our racial and ethnic minorities who were stuck in neighborhoods that were deteriorating because they couldn't get a loan within their own neighborhood and they couldn't get a loan to purchase outside of their neighborhood. And as a result, we had about 3 decades, about 35, 40 years of this de jure segregation. What followed was known as de facto segregation. De facto means by custom or by culture. So once we had decades and over a generation of forced legal separation, once we changed the rules, it's not like segregation ended overnight. So how we could apply this is through a case study. When we could look at a city like Baltimore, or we could look at a city like Oakland, and we could use redlining as our basis, our historical background, to validate the segregation that exists today. So when we look at a topic like segregation, again, whether it be through redlining in American cities or whether it be through discrimination in places like Northern Ireland between the Protestants and the Catholics, we could use these case studies to provide evidence of a phenomena. We could provide a valid argument that's reliable in other places when we see how segregation leads to unequal opportunity for different groups involved. So a case study, again, a clear and well-defined example of something that's happening in a city. And our case studies, really, where they supply a lot of value, is that they provide theoretical and empirical evidence. These exist. So we're not just saying segregation is bad and it leads to this, because it is, that's our theory, but we're also providing that empirical evidence. We're showing that the group that's been discriminated against, that suffered through segregation, has less generational wealth, has less home equity, has fewer educational and economic opportunities. So we can show that segregation has these lifelong and generational attributes where one group will have a greater probability of doing well, where another group is at a greater risk of suffering, of falling behind, or in some cases further behind. So the case study, again, provides theoretical and empirical evidence. Very important. So when you look to conduct your field work, you're going to, again, look at theoretical and empirical evidence. You're going to put together, through your field study, through your field work, a mini case study. When we look at case studies, Again, we like to use that validity and reliability argument. And Jane Jacobs, with her work, where we often see how she was able to use depth of investigation to offset breadth. So while noted the case study or the approach of doing a case study on segregation would look at a number of cities, a case study can stand alone in one city, as Jacobs did with her work. There are a couple types of case studies. The first is what's known as typical or stereotypical, and this is a case study that's representative of others. So again, if we think about that topic of segregation, we can see how general lessons, not specific people or places, are really the outcome, and how segregation policies really have the same general lessons, the same general outcomes over different places. Again, if it's Baltimore, if it's Oakland, if it's Belfast in Northern Ireland, we see these general lessons of winners and losers, of those that benefit and those that really suffer from segregation. The Chen textbook looks at a small town, Muncie, Indiana, and examined how Muncie was the typical American city, and it was a focus on class and power, and it was really just looking to provide a general lesson of what's happening in the country, a stereotypical approach to answering basic questions. So again, the type of work that you're going to engage in is most likely going to follow this typical stereotypical route. You're not looking to conduct a case study that serves as a prototypical case study. And a prototypical case study is a model that others can follow. A prototypical case study takes considerable work. And for the level of research that we're doing in this class, whether it is a few weeks or a few months, we're not looking to put together prototypical case studies. Again, our focus is going to be more on general lessons, that your fieldwork can be representative of other places, and that your theory and your evidence is something that is rather common. A prototypical case study, again, is one that others can follow. And when we think back on the topics we've covered, we think about the Chicago School, right? The Chicago School of Sociology put together that concentric zone or concentric ring model that really allowed others to understand what was happening in their places. Sassen's Global Cities, right, using the framework that she did to explore New York, Tokyo, and London. Again, these are prototypical, where they're putting together these models that establish a methodology for investigation, that they're making the rules, and they're saying that this is the key example for others to use going forward. And a prototypical case study, it's put to the test. So it needs to have a great deal of supporting evidence. It needs to be clear. The rules and the methodology for applying this to others need to be clear, because you're creating new information, and you're setting a new set of guidelines for how to explore and understand phenomena occurring in cities. Two different approaches to our case studies. The first is ethnographic, which includes fieldwork. And as you think ahead to the type of research and fieldwork and work you're going to do in your field reports, you're looking again probably at that typical case study done in an ethnographic manner. Ethnographic fieldwork includes observations on the ground, qualitative data, right? We're not looking at quantitative data. You can certainly support your arguments with stats, but you're looking at engaging. You're looking at immersing yourself in a community, right? Gathering the sights, the sounds, the smells, not so much the census data, but you're looking to immerse yourself in this place to get a well-rounded, thorough understanding of what's happening. You can certainly interview people, and as I mentioned earlier, you need to be mindful when you communicate with somebody about a potential bias or an agenda they have, right? If you're looking at a major development project and you interview a longtime shop owner whose business is at the threat of being displaced because of the development, they're probably not going to have a very fond view of this. But if you're looking at somebody who's new to the area and is looking for additional amenities, they might really like the idea of growth and development. So again, as you go into this process, if you do choose to interview somebody, make sure that you're balancing your interviews. Make sure you're understanding objectivity versus subjectivity. Um, the Chentex points out what's called a go along, and that's where you don't just show up and interview people in a third place or an arbitrary setting. You actually follow a person through their experience, and I don't anticipate that for this class we're completing a go along, but it's a way to further immerse yourself into a community, into a place. Ethnographic case studies look at really human interaction and what it means to be in a place. Think back to the work that Gons did on the West End of Boston when his ethnographic case study and his ethnographic research painted a picture quite different than what the quantitative research suggested. So the city had targeted the West End of Boston as a blighted area, and a blighted area means you're not going to get any investment. Self-fulfilling prophecy. You're going to experience further decline. People are going to leave. But what Gons found again was something quite different. Through his field work, through immersing himself in this community for a number of months, through interviewing people, getting to know people, going through their daily routines, he was able to provide a much different picture of what was happening in that part of the city. And the second type is what's known as a historical approach. And this looks at the virtues of the place. And virtues of the place really focuses on the historical past. So how has the history of a location shaped the lives there? When we think about something like the women's suffrage movement, right? Where did these women come from? Where did these key players come from? And the history of their hometowns will provide some evidence as to why these individuals were the way they were. A couple of the women involved were from the island of Nantucket, which is off the southeast coast of Massachusetts. And Nantucket was known for a place of really progressive gender equality for the time period, for the 18th and 19th century. Not so much an overt movement, but rather fewer barriers, fewer restrictive gender norms in place. So when we examine the history of this place, the virtues of this place, we see why an island with not a lot of people, a few hundred people, could start to move towards a greater movement for voting rights and for different forms of equality. So, the historical virtues of a place often help us understand why something is happening where it is. So keep that in mind as you start to think about how you want to approach your field work, right? The ethnographic, getting to know the people on the ground, immersing yourself in that through observations, through asking questions, through encountering situations, really just spending time there, digesting what you're seeing and experiencing. The history of a place is important because you really need to know the platform on which you're going to try and explain what's happening. So the case study, again, it's a well-defined example. It highlights a phenomena or a set of variables that you're looking to explain. You can do it through a typical or prototypical approach. Again, prototypical requires a tremendous amount of creativity and a new way of examining, a new way of putting forth methods and rules for examining a city, whereas that typical case study is really looking for general lessons and comparing this place to others. So as you set forth, remember, keep reliability and validity in mind. You want to make sure that your arguments are sustainable, and consider the different ways in which our theorists explain cities. Match their theories with empirical evidence. So you're going to look at this in two parts, right? A theory that tells me what's going on, and the empirical evidence, my observations, my findings that support my claim that this is true.